In royal courts, death was never just death. It was drama, disgrace, and sometimes a punchline written in blood. From kings gored by buffalo to emperors undone by soup, history's most powerful met ends so absurd, so humiliating, you'd think they were scripted by irony itself. This isn't your high school history class. It's 30 crown-wearing disasters, each more unbelievable than the last. So dim the lights, silence the courtiers, and prepare yourself, because these are the 30 worst ways a royal died, and not one of them got a fairy tale ending. Before we dive in, if twisted tales of royal disaster are your kind of bedtime story, hit that subscribe button and join us for more dark dives into history's strangest corners. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you listening at 3 a.m. like a true night historian, or sneaking this in between classes? We see you. Now let's begin. 1. Edward II of England. There are kings who die on battlefields in front of cheering armies or weeping wives. And then there's Edward II of England, a monarch whose final moments were so wrapped in humiliation, conspiracy, and grotesque rumour that historians are still debating how a man can die so publicly and still leave behind no certainties. To say Edward II was an unpopular king would be like saying the Black Death was an inconvenience. From the moment he took the throne in 1307, Edward was perceived as weak, indulgent, and distractible. Traits that would have been merely inconvenient in a poet, but were catastrophic in a ruler of a divided, war-weary kingdom. His reign was dominated by his blatant favoritism, especially toward Piers Gaveston, a nobleman whose influence was so excessive that English barons executed him without royal permission. Edward, devastated but powerless, spent the next several years ricocheting between military failures and domestic humiliation. And yet, it was his own queen, Isabella of France, who would eventually deliver the final blow. Furious at his continued favoritism toward a new pair of courtiers, the Despencer family, and disgusted by her own treatment, Isabella aligned with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and led an invasion of England in 1326. Edward fled, of course, because of course he did. Captured, imprisoned, and forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, he was no longer king. He was barely a man at all in the eyes of those who had once bowed to him. The official record states he died at Berkeley Castle in 1327. That's it. Just died. No fanfare, no great speeches, just death, somewhere in the wet stone silence of a Gloucestershire fortress. But here's where it gets complicated and grotesquely fascinating. Within a generation, rumours began circulating that his death was not natural. Chroniclers began adding lurid details, the most infamous involving a red-hot poker and a particularly vulnerable royal orifice. The implication, his assassins had wanted to leave no visible mark on the body, no trace that could be examined. Only pain, only shame. Historians today argue over the accuracy of this account. Some claim it was pure political propaganda, crafted by enemies to make his end feel as ridiculous as his reign. Others believe something brutal did happen, just maybe not that brutal. Still, the rumors stuck, because that's the thing about shame. It doesn't need to be real to leave a stain. And whether Edward II was murdered in theatrical agony or simply faded into death like a deposed man tends to do, one truth remains: no one really mourned him. His tomb was more elaborate than his legacy, and the England he left behind was tired, bloodied, and relieved, but not for long, because a few generations later, another royal death would go from ridiculous to cartoonishly absurd. Picture this: a king, a palace, a corridor, and a really, really low doorway. 2. Charles VIII of France. History has never had much patience for clumsiness, especially when it's wearing a crown. For Charles VIII of France, his reign began with ambition and ended with architecture, or more specifically, a doorframe. Charles VIII wasn't exactly born for elegance. He had a prominent jaw, a stammer, and a restlessness that seemed to vibrate just beneath his skin. Still, he became king at the age of 13, inheriting a France that was licking its wounds from war and internal conflict. He grew into the kind of monarch whose ambitions outstripped his judgment, a trait that tends to get people killed or at least seriously inconvenienced. For Charles, it led to one of the strangest royal deaths on record, one that could almost be mistaken for slapstick if it didn't end in complete and irreversible failure. But before the doorframe, there was Italy. Charles spent much of his reign obsessed with reclaiming the Kingdom of Naples. It was a glittering prize, an old Angevin claim, and Charles convinced himself he was the man to take it. In 1494, he launched an extravagant campaign across the Alps, dragging an army so large it caused bottlenecks in medieval villages. Initially, the invasion was a success. He swept into Naples almost theatrically, declaring himself king and hosting lavish ceremonies. But Charles had miscalculated badly. As quickly as he arrived, he was driven out by a hastily formed anti-French coalition, a confederation of states suddenly very motivated to remind him that southern Italy was not up for grabs. The entire expedition collapsed like a soggy pastry. By the time Charles returned to France, the only thing he had brought back was debt, disease, and a deeply bruised ego, and that's where the doorframe comes in. On April the 7th, 1498, Charles VIII was strolling through the Château d'Amboise with his entourage. He was heading to watch a game of tennis, a reminder that even kings need distractions, especially after geopolitical embarrassment. As he passed through a narrow corridor, he failed to duck beneath a low wooden lintel. Witnesses claimed he struck his head violently, but brushed it off with a laugh. Then he collapsed. He never got back up. Accounts say he lingered for several hours, slipping in and out of consciousness before dying later that evening. The cause? Likely a brain aneurysm triggered by the impact, or perhaps a pre-existing condition worsened by stress, poor health, and a literal blow to the head. The specifics were debated then, and they're still uncertain now. What's certain is that France had lost its king to a piece of wood no taller than an average man. It was a profoundly undignified death for someone who had fancied himself a conqueror, not on the battlefield, not in exile, not even by poison or betrayal, just gravity, just carelessness. Just a door he didn't see coming. Charles's sudden death left France in a political lurch. He died without a male heir, triggering a succession crisis that rippled through the Valois line. His life, marked by overreach, ended in the kind of accident that would barely warrant a footnote in a lesser man's story, but for a king, it became his defining moment. The kind of ending that made even his enemies pause, blink, and wonder if fate had developed a sense of sarcasm. And while Charles may have met his end in silence and confusion, the next royal didn't have that luxury. He never ruled, never reigned, and barely even walked free. His entire life was a prison, and his death a grim punctuation to a story that never truly began. And if you've made it this far, through a royal bludgeoning by doorway and a lifetime prison sentence ending in a rescue gone wrong, you're clearly one of us. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. We're building a kingdom of midnight thinkers and history addicts, and you belong here. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Are you watching this with coffee at sunrise or spiraling at 2 a.m. like a true scholar of royal misfortune? Either way, you're in the right place. 3. Ivan VI of Russia, born into power, exiled into oblivion, and murdered into myth. Ivan VI of Russia might be the only monarch whose most famous achievement was surviving infancy. Barely. His reign began at 2 months old. Yes, months. In 1740, following the death of Empress Anna of Russia, infant Ivan was proclaimed emperor. He couldn't walk, couldn't talk, and presumably couldn't pronounce the name of the country he now ruled. But none of that mattered. The real power lay in the hands of his appointed regent, Ernst Johann von Biron, until he was overthrown 2 weeks later. Then came another regent, then another, and then the coup de grace. A young, calculating woman named Elizabeth Petrovna seized the throne in 1741, declaring herself Empress of Russia. Ivan was deposed at just over a year old, and yet, in the twisted logic of dynastic politics, Ivan's mere existence posed a threat. A baby with a crown in his past was still a rival to the throne. And rivals, no matter how small or unaware, were liabilities in imperial Russia. So the solution was as simple as it was cruel: make him disappear. Ivan was moved from fortress to fortress like a living state secret. He grew up behind bars, surrounded not by courtiers or tutors, but stone walls and silent guards. He was denied contact with the outside world, his name erased from official memory, his face unknown even to the people of his own generation. No tutors, no education. He didn't even know who he really was until he was nearly a teenager. Imagine realizing you're a royal heir, not through destiny or ceremony, but through whispers behind locked doors. By the 1760s, Ivan was being held in solitary confinement at Schlisselburg Fortress, a cold slab of isolation on Lake Ladoga. Catherine the Great, who had overthrown Elizabeth's successor, viewed him with growing paranoia. Rumors of plots to free him swirled through the Russian court like smoke through rafters, and Catherine was not the sort to wait for the fire. In 1764, the fire came. A group of officers, perhaps acting under unclear instructions, attempted to rescue Ivan from his prison, but the guards had been ordered with chilling clarity: if anyone tries to free him, kill him first. The moment they heard footsteps, the guards did what they were trained to do. Ivan was stabbed quickly, brutally, and without trial. By the time the rescuers arrived, the boy emperor who never ruled had been extinguished, his entire life nothing more than a political footnote, terminated in silence. And here's the irony. By that point, Ivan posed no real threat. He had no supporters, no resources, no experience. He had lived his entire existence in captivity, forgotten by history and remembered only by the handful of guards tasked with containing him. And still Russia feared him. Still they couldn't take the risk. Ivan VI died the way he lived, trapped, unacknowledged, and erased. His body was buried in secret. His name was redacted. His story was muted. But the next royal, he died with flair, or rather flavor, because nothing says exit with style quite like drowning in your own personal wine cellar. 4. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. If Ivan VI's life was one long captivity, George Plantagenet's story is a study in self-sabotage. The younger brother of King Edward IV and a central player in England's blood-soaked Wars of the Roses, George managed to combine privilege, paranoia, and poor judgment into a cocktail so potent that it eventually became his execution warrant. And fittingly, that's also exactly how his end would be remembered: a cocktail, a giant, sloshing, deadly cocktail. George was born in 1449, a prince of the House of York, in an England at civil war with itself. The Wars of the Roses weren't simply battles between rival noble houses. They were a generational conflict over legitimacy, loyalty, and power that turned cousins into enemies and brothers into opportunists. George, unfortunately for himself, excelled at being an opportunist. At various times, he supported his elder brother Edward IV, then betrayed him, then returned to him, then betrayed him again. It was as if treachery was his preferred form of exercise. For a while, Edward tolerated it. After all, George was his brother, and the Plantagenets were not exactly famous for sibling harmony. But George's paranoia grew alongside his ambition. Convinced that Edward's court was filled with enemies plotting his downfall, George became reckless. He supported the Earl of Warwick, once Edward's chief ally, now his enemy, and married Warwick's daughter, Isabella Neville. When Warwick rebelled against Edward, George sided with him, effectively taking arms against his own brother. The rebellion failed, as rebellions tend to do, and George was forced to crawl back into Edward's favour. But forgiveness has a half-life. By the 1470s, George's erratic behaviour had become dangerous even for a royal. He accused one of Edward's associates of poisoning his wife. He began dabbling in rumours of prophecies predicting the death of Edward's heirs, prophecies that, strangely enough, pointed to a man whose initial was G. The implication wasn't subtle. The whispers reached Edward. This time there would be no return. In 1478, George was arrested for treason, tried by Parliament, and condemned to death. Yet even at the end, the spectacle of a royal execution needed to be contained. No public beheading, no showy display. Edward allowed his brother the privilege of a private execution within the Tower of London. Here the story veers into legend. Chroniclers, especially later Tudor writers, claimed George was executed by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine, a rich sweet drink he loved. Whether true or not, the image was irresistible. A man so fond of indulgence, meeting his end immersed in it. A literal baptism of excess. Some historians argue he was simply beheaded in private. Others believe the wine story is a smear designed to make his death seem comical, a dark morality tale about greed and betrayal. But the symbolism endures. In an age when power was fleeting and loyalty negotiable, George Plantagenet became the cautionary emblem of overplaying your hand, an ambitious man who switched sides once too often and sank, quite possibly literally, in the very vice that defined him. And if George's end was decadent, his royal neighbour in history was undone by something far more mundane, almost domestic. No poison, no coup, no betrayal, just dinner. A plate of lampreys so rich and so beloved that a king simply couldn't resist, and paid the ultimate price for his appetite. 5. Henry I of England. Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, was not supposed to be king, but fate, accidents, and a well-timed coin purse ensured he ended up on the throne anyway. Ruthless, calculating, and very much aware that power is never a gift, only a loan. His reign was long and comparatively stable for a medieval monarch, defined by legal reforms, administrative efficiency, and the kind of paranoia that comes from watching your entire family tear itself to pieces over succession. But in the end, it wasn't war, treachery, or even treason that killed Henry I. It was dinner. Specifically, it was lampreys, a snake-like fish with the consistency of regret and the reputation of a delicacy. Rich, oily, and deeply loved by Henry, lampreys were a culinary status symbol in Norman England, the kind of meal that said, "I conquered you, and now I'm eating your eels." The year was 1135. Henry, now in his late 60s, a remarkable age at the time, especially for someone who had survived multiple succession crises, was hunting in Normandy, the old family stronghold. After a long day of royal sport, he sat down to one of his favourite meals, a heaping plate of lampreys. His physicians warned him not to eat them, whether because of their richness, his age, or some undiagnosed underlying condition. The king was advised to abstain. But Henry, true to form, did not appreciate advice, especially from people he paid to talk quietly while he ignored them. He devoured the dish. Within days, the king fell violently ill. Contemporary sources vaguely describe symptoms of digestive agony, fever, and what they ominously called a sudden affliction. Medieval medicine being what it was, part astrology, part guesswork, part expensive herbs, it's unclear exactly what happened. Modern historians have proposed everything from food poisoning to uremia to a perforated bowel. What is clear is that the illness moved fast, and it moved decisively. On December the 1st, 1135, Henry I died at Lyon-le-Forêt in Normandy. His death marked the end of the direct male line of William the Conqueror, and it plunged England into a nearly two-decade-long civil war known as the Anarchy. Because Henry, in all his wisdom, had spent more time on royal feasts than succession planning. His only legitimate son had drowned in the White Ship disaster years earlier, and his chosen heir, his daughter, the Empress Matilda, was wildly unpopular with the Anglo-Norman barons. The result? A brutal war between Matilda and her cousin Stephen that left England fractured, bled dry, and desperately nostalgic for the days when kings merely died of indigestion. There's something absurdly tragic about Henry's end. A man who outmaneuvered his rivals, codified royal justice, and centralized power with cold precision, undone by a plate of fish, not an assassin's blade, not a poisoned chalice, just a dish of lampreys and a refusal to listen. And if Henry's death was about indulgence, the next one was about deception. Because when a king dies from soup, it's not the ingredients that matter. It's who made it and why. A poisoned bowl, a locked prison, and a royal dinner no one lived to regret. 6. Eric XIV of Sweden. There's a certain irony in being known more for your death than your reign, especially if your reign involved bouts of madness, a suspicious murder or two, and a growing list of nobles who wanted you gone. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a Renaissance monarch: intellect, charm, a reformer's spirit, and unfortunately, a mind that began to slowly unravel while the throne beneath him grew increasingly shaky. Born in 1533, Eric was the eldest son of Gustav Vasa, the founder of modern Sweden. When his father died in 1560, Eric inherited not just a kingdom, but the delicate balancing act of ruling a nation still finding its footing between Catholic Europe and the rising tide of Lutheranism. He began with promise, diplomatic, energetic, and ambitious. He wanted Sweden to be more than a northern backwater. He wanted it to matter. But within a few years, it became clear that the man on the throne was fighting enemies both real and imagined. Paranoia began to seep into Eric's decisions like water through cracked stone. He distrusted his half-brothers, especially John, Duke of Finland, and saw conspiracies in every whispered court conversation. This was not a court of quiet diplomacy, but one of suspicion, surveillance, and sudden arrests. By 1567, his paranoia took a deadly turn. In what would later be called the Stura murders, Eric personally oversaw, or possibly participated in, the killing of several noblemen from the powerful Stura family, whom he suspected of plotting against him. These were not battlefield executions. These were eliminations, swift, dramatic, and very public. And though Eric would claim temporary insanity, the damage was done. The nobility recoiled, his advisors backed away, his brother John moved in. By 1568, Eric was overthrown in a relatively bloodless coup led by John, who became King John III. Eric, still technically alive and legally inconvenient, was imprisoned. And then the real punishment began. He would spend the next 8 years shuttled between castles, his movements restricted, his communications monitored, and his dignity eroded one silent hallway at a time. Occasionally there were flickers of rehabilitation, rumours that he might be restored, talks of negotiations. All of them led nowhere, because John and much of the Swedish nobility had come to the same conclusion. As long as Eric lived, Sweden would never be truly stable. And so, in 1577, after years of confinement, Eric was served a bowl of pea soup. He ate it, and within hours he was dead. That's all the record tells us. The autopsy at the time, rudimentary and politically cautious, was inconclusive. Later reports quietly suggested poisoning, though no one dared speak it too loudly. After all, the dead cannot protest, and the living, particularly those in power, prefer their ghosts uninvestigated. So Eric XIV, once the most promising monarch of Sweden, became a cautionary footnote. A king who went mad lost his throne and died in a prison cell with a spoon in his hand. His name would live on mostly as a warning that intelligence without stability is not wisdom, and power without trust is only temporary. And if Eric's fate was sealed behind locked doors and cold stone, the next royal's end came in open air under the sound of gunfire, where no one could agree if it was an enemy's bullet or a comrade's. 7. Charles the XII of Sweden. There are kings who die in bed, surrounded by bishops and the scent of burning candles. And then there are kings like Charles the XII of Sweden, who seem destined to go out on horseback, mid-charge, with a bullet in the head and a war still unfinished, which more or less is exactly what happened. Born in 1682, Charles the XII wasn't raised to rule quietly. He ascended the throne at the age of 15, and instead of being steered gently by regents or guided by cautious advisers, he launched Sweden into a series of full-throttle military campaigns that would eventually unravel the empire his predecessors had spent a century building. But in the beginning, he looked like a prodigy. He marched into battle, young, fearless, and unnervingly calm, the kind of king who didn't just issue commands. He stood in the mud beside his soldiers, in the thick of cannon smoke and icy winds, and for a time it worked. Early victories against Denmark, Poland, and Russia bolstered his legend. He became known as the Warrior King, a monarch more at home in a battlefield tent than in a throne room. But legends, like empires, require upkeep, and Charles pushed his luck. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, his army was decisively defeated by Peter the Great of Russia. It was a loss so staggering that it shattered Sweden's position as a major European power overnight. Charles fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he spent 5 long, awkward years in exile, plotting, negotiating, and occasionally provoking his reluctant hosts. When he finally returned to Sweden in 1715, his empire was in pieces. His people were exhausted. His treasury was a ghost of its former self. But Charles, unfazed, decided to double down on war. He turned his attention to Norway, then under Danish control, and launched an ambitious winter campaign in 1718. It was the kind of decision only a man completely committed or completely isolated would make. On the night of November 30th, Charles was inspecting trenches at the siege of Fredrikstad Fortress in Norway. Accounts agree that he lifted his head above the parapet. A moment later, he was dead. A bullet had passed cleanly through his skull, but that's where the agreement ends. No one ever definitively proved where the shot came from. Was it fired by a Norwegian defender from within the fortress? Or was it, as some whispered, the work of one of Charles's own men, weary of endless war and a king who seemed to prefer death in battle over peace at home? Theories proliferated. The angle of the bullet, the lack of an autopsy, the rumors of political fatigue within his own ranks, even his famously stoic expression at the moment of death, a detail repeated in almost every account, became part of the mythology. He died the way he lived, stone-faced, silent, in the thick of war. In a sense, Charles got exactly what he wanted. He never had to broker peace, never had to sit in a quiet room and contemplate compromise, never had to rebuild what he had broken. His story ends mid-campaign, mid-winter, mid-empire. The bullet did not just end a life, it ended an era. And yet, as stark as Charles's death was, it pales in comparison to what came next. A royal tragedy, not of steel or gunpowder, but of flesh and blood. A young queen consort, a birth, a child, and a death so common among royal women it became invisible, even as it took them one by one. 8. Constance of Castile. In the great painted halls of medieval Europe, queens were rarely painted alone. They were always someone's consort, someone's mother, someone's political solution wrapped in velvet and diplomacy. Constance of Castile, second wife to King Louis VII of France, was no exception, though her story ended with something even less exceptional for her time. a childbirth that never saw the dawn. Constance entered French history through the side door, through Spain. She was born around 1136, the daughter of Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile, a man who styled himself Emperor of all Spain. Her marriage to Louis VII in 1154 was less about love and more about undoing the awkward silence left behind by his first wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. That union had ended in annulment, and Eleanor had gone on to marry Henry II of England, becoming the mother of Richard the Lionheart and John. In terms of PR, Louis needed a win. Enter Constance. She was young, well-connected, and obedient. She came with the blessings of the Spanish crown and the promise of sons, a sacred currency for medieval dynasties. Louis, still haunted by his failure to produce a male heir with Eleanor, pinned all his hopes on Constance's womb. The pressure must have been stifling. In court, she would have been surrounded by whispers about Eleanor's past, about the English king rising in power across the Channel, and most of all, about her own ability to deliver what France believed it deserved: a prince, a future. To her credit, Constance delivered. Twice. In 1155, she bore Philip, later known as Philip II, or Philip Augustus, a monarch who would go on to dramatically reshape France. A second son, Peter, followed in 1158. By all accounts, her position seemed secure. She had done what was required. She had borne heirs. She had done it young. And then suddenly she was gone. The records are sparse. Most simply note that Constance died in childbirth sometime in the early 1160s, likely attempting to bring a third child into the world. The child did not survive. Neither did she. No chronicler lingers on her pain. No monk recorded the final words she might have whispered, if she whispered at all. She simply stopped being a queen and started being a cause for remarriage, and so she was replaced. Louis remarried just weeks later, an unseemly haste even by medieval standards. His new bride, Adele of Champagne, would go on to bear him more children. Constance, meanwhile, faded into historical blur, her contributions reduced to genealogical footnotes and a marble tomb in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. No scandal, no murder, no palace intrigue, just the slow, quiet erosion of memory. But here's the thing about royal deaths. The ones that come in blood and fire get remembered, but the ones that come quietly, on linen sheets, behind chamber doors, are no less violent, just less theatrical. And while Constance's death left no accusations and no conspiracies, the next royal wouldn't be so lucky. His final hours would unfold in a room filled with smoke, silence, and servants bound by rules so strict they watched a king die rather than break them. 9. Philip III of Spain. Monarchs are supposed to rule over etiquette, not be ruled by it. But in the case of Philip III of Spain, it wasn't rebellion, illness, or treason that brought about his demise. It was a brazier, a small glowing charcoal heater, and a room full of courtiers so paralyzed by protocol that they stood and watched a king cook to death, politely. Philip III wasn't one of Spain's more dynamic kings. His reign, from 1598 to 1621, was marked less by personal achievement than by delegation, most notably to his powerful favourite, the Duke of Lerma, who effectively ran the kingdom while Philip attended religious ceremonies and cloistered court rituals. If Philip was passionate about anything, it was ceremony. He believed deeply in the divinely ordained hierarchy of power and position. Unfortunately, so did everyone else around him. In March of 1621, Philip was in Madrid during what should have been the twilight of a long and uneventful rule. He had fallen ill with a fever, and as was customary at the time, a brazier was placed in his room to keep the air warm. But at some point, the warmth became too much. The room began to overheat. The king was visibly sweating, struggling to breathe. Courtiers shifted uncomfortably. Physicians looked concerned, yet no one moved the brazier. Why? Because moving the brazier was not the job of just anyone. In the rigid structure of Spanish court etiquette, every task had its assigned noble, and the noble responsible for managing the brazier wasn't present. To touch it without the proper rank would have been a breach of court protocol, unthinkable in a world where stepping out of line, even to save a life, could mean disgrace. And so the king continued to bake. By the time someone of the appropriate rank arrived to adjust the brazier, the damage was done. Philip's fever had worsened into a full-blown collapse. Over the following days, he deteriorated rapidly. On March 31st, 1621, he died of what was likely a combination of heat exhaustion and pre-existing illness, all exacerbated by a cultural obsession with order over action. It would be comic if it weren't so chilling. The king of one of the most powerful empires in the world, a man who ruled over territories from the Americas to Asia, was felled not by armies or assassins, but by a small metal furnace and a room full of well-dressed statues, too afraid of their own job descriptions to act. And if Philip's death was a masterclass in the dangers of excessive decorum, the next royal tragedy would come wrapped in mystery and mud. A king in a forest, a hunt, a single arrow, and a hunting accident that's looked suspicious for over 900 years. 10. William II, Rufus of England. If medieval England had a genre, it would be political thriller. Equal parts blood feud, inheritance drama, and fatal accidents that don't quite feel accidental. Which brings us to William II of England, better known as William Rufus, the red-headed son of William the Conqueror. His nickname came from either his ruddy complexion or his temper. Accounts differ, but his reign, like his personality, was stormy and suspicious from start to finish. His end, however, was the part that raised eyebrows for centuries. William Rufus ruled from 1087 to 1100, a time when the Norman grip on England was still relatively fresh, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. His reign was marked by tension with the church, a flair for taxation, and a habit of governing more like a soldier than a statesman. He was famously unmarried and without heirs, an oddity for a king, especially one with two ambitious brothers waiting in the wings. On August 2nd, 1100, William set out for a hunting trip in the New Forest, an area already infamous for being unlucky for his family. His older brother Richard had died there in a similar outing years before, but William, either fearless or fatalistic, rode out with his usual entourage, including a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell. What happened next was simple, or suspiciously so. According to the official version, a deer leapt, Tyrrell fired his arrow, and William, by sheer misfortune, rode into the path of the shot. The arrow struck him in the chest, puncturing his lungs. He died almost instantly. Tyrrell, panicked or guilty, depending on whom you ask, fled the scene. William's body was abandoned by his retinue, eventually carted back to Winchester by peasants, slung over a horse like firewood. A tragedy, yes, but not exactly convincing. The accidental shooting of a king during a hunting trip is the kind of explanation that only raises more questions. Tyrrell's immediate flight suggests something more than fear. The fact that no formal investigation followed, a remarkable thing for a royal death, further stoked suspicion. And then there's the matter of who benefited. Enter Henry. William's younger brother, Henry, was also in the New Forest that day. When news of William's death reached him, he didn't rush to mourn. He rushed to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and within days had himself crowned king. Efficient, almost too efficient. Contemporaries were divided. Some believed it was divine punishment, God striking down a blasphemous king who taxed churches and offended bishops. Others whispered darker things, fratricide masked as misfortune. Theories circulated that the hunting trip was a setup, that Tyrrell was a tool, and Henry the true architect. None of it was ever proven. No charges, no trials, just a dead king, an empty throne, and a brother who moved too fast to grieve. William Rufus's grave is still in Winchester Cathedral, marked with simplicity for a life that ended anything but an arrow, a forest, a silence that still echoes. And while his death felt suspicious, the next royal met his end in a far more deliberate fashion, stabbed not in error but on command, in a palace where loyalty came with a dagger and the throne was guarded by those most likely to kill you. 11. Caliph Al-Mutawakkil. In the corridors of Abbasid power, where golden domes glittered and silken whispers carried death sentences, few endings were as theatrically grim or as politically calculated as that of Caliph Al-Mutawakkil, ruler of the Islamic world's most powerful empire from 847 to 861 CE. He reigned from Baghdad over a sprawling realm of scholars, poets, merchants, and generals. But while his court glowed with refinement, its foundations trembled with danger, because in the Abbasid Caliphate, being on the throne meant being surrounded, often literally, by men who might kill you in your sleep, or worse, while you were still awake. Al-Mutawakkil began his reign with confidence. He reversed many of the policies of his predecessors, attempting to reassert the absolute authority of the caliph over the rapidly fragmenting state. He distanced himself from the rationalist theologians who had once defined Abbasid intellectualism, returning instead to orthodoxy. But what truly set his reign apart, and what sealed his fate, was his growing distrust of the Turkish military elite who had come to dominate court politics. These Turkish guards weren't merely soldiers, they were kingmakers. Imported and elevated under previous caliphs, as a counterbalance to Arab and Persian power, the Turkish regiments had, by Al-Mutawakkil's time, become an autonomous and unpredictable force. They controlled access to the caliph, manipulated court appointments, and, most crucially, understood their importance. For a while, Al-Mutawakkil tolerated this uneasy arrangement. Then he tried to dismantle it. That was, in hindsight, a fatal decision. The caliph began by stripping Turkish officers of privileges. He transferred command structures, shuffled loyalties, and plotted to replace the Turkish faction entirely. Worse, he confided these plans to his son, Al-Mu'taz, and a few trusted officials, none of whom could keep a secret for very long. Word spread. The Turkish guards, already sensitive to shifts in power, learned of the plan, and in a regime where the difference between a promotion and a dagger was one whisper, they decided not to wait for their dismissal. On the night of December the 10th, 861, the caliph dined with his son Al-Mu'taz at the palace of Al-Jafari. He had been drinking, laughing even, and then the guards entered, not just one or two, but several, not in a rush, but calmly, purposefully, as if this too was just part of protocol. They stabbed him repeatedly. Some accounts say his own son allowed it to happen, or even authorized it. The motivations remain muddy. Was it purely the military's retaliation? A palace coup? A succession plan gone too far? Or perhaps just the end result of years of political erosion where no one, not even a caliph, could push too hard without inviting the blade. What's most striking is how unremarkable his death became. Not because it wasn't violent, but because this was what power looked like. At the time, glittering on the surface, but built over a pit of knives. His body was reportedly left without ceremony. The empire moved on. The throne did not stay empty long, but the next royal to fall, he wouldn't be murdered in his palace. He'd be dragged into despair, broken slowly, not by soldiers, but by silence, blindness, and betrayal so personal, it didn't even need a sword to end him. 12. Shah Shuja of Persia. The decline of a royal life is often marked by quiet humiliations, titles lost, favors withdrawn, footsteps that no longer pause outside your door. But for Shah Shuja of Persia, the descent wasn't quiet. It was theatrical, long drawn out, a public unmaking that transformed a prince into a prisoner into a ghost, and a ghost into a warning. Shuja was born into power, noble blood, royal ambition, and a father who had ruled with the iron certainty of a dynasty not yet in decline. In the mid-15th century, the Timurid Empire, once expansive and glorious under the infamous Timur or Tamerlane, had begun to fracture. Shah Shuja belonged to a generation tasked with holding the pieces together. Instead, they dropped them. A prince of the Timurid line, Shuja was the son of Shah Rukh and the grandson of Timur himself, inheriting not just land and lineage, but all the enemies that came with both. The Timurid Empire by then was less a unified realm than a chessboard of rival cousins and treacherous governors. Every city was a throne waiting to be claimed or stolen, and Shuja wanted more than his share. He was intelligent, cultured, and by some accounts, dangerously ambitious. For a while he ruled parts of Persia, navigating the political currents with the caution of a man who knows too much can go wrong too fast. But the family drama that had become synonymous with the Timurids finally caught up with him. The empire, unstable and fraying at its edges, turned inwards. Alliances collapsed, bloodlines blurred, brothers became rivals, and rivals became executioners. Eventually, Shuja was captured by one of his own relatives, possibly his brother, possibly his cousin, depending on which version of the story survives your historian's pen. He was not executed, not at first. That would have been merciful. Instead, he was managed, kept alive, kept visible, and slowly dismantled. They blinded him. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement. In Timurid political theory, a ruler had to be physically whole to rule. Take away the eyes, and you took away legitimacy. You took away the throne without shedding a drop of royal blood. And so Shuja became the perfect cautionary tale, a prince who could no longer see and yet still saw too much. Imprisonment followed, though not the clean kind, behind stone and locks. He was paraded, mocked, treated not like a fallen king, but like a relic of an age that the new rulers wanted to erase. Some say he was starved, others that he was denied even basic dignity. What's certain is that he was allowed to live just long enough to remember what it meant to have ruled. He died not in a blaze of rebellion or a noble act of resistance, but in quiet torment, forgotten by those who feared him, tolerated by those who had broken him, remembered only by those who saw in his story a reflection of what the empire itself had become, brilliant, fractured and slowly collapsing under its own ambition. And if Shah Shuja was undone by slow betrayal and internal decay, the next royal would be brought down by something even older and more brutal: civil war. A severed head, a silent street, and a capital that watched as its caliph fell, not in battle, but after it. 13. Al-Amin, Abbasid Caliph. The streets of Baghdad have seen triumph, blood, and everything in between, but few stories echo as bitterly through the alleyways of its golden age as the downfall of Caliph Al-Amin. His was a death not just of a man or even of a monarch, but of the illusion that family bonds could survive the gravity of absolute power. In the great theatre of the Abbasid dynasty, where brothers were made into rivals and oaths were etched in sand, Al-Amin's end became both a spectacle and a warning. In empire, the ties of blood are conditional. Al-Amin was born in 787, the privileged son of Harun al-Rashid, perhaps the most famous caliph of the Abbasid dynasty. Raised in the opulent courts of Baghdad, he lived in a world of poetry, scholarship, and political theatre. He was Harun's favoured son by his Arab wife, and that detail, his mother's lineage, would shape the empire's future more than anyone anticipated. Harun had two prominent sons, Al-Amin and his half-brother Al-Ma'mun, born to a Persian concubine. In a classic attempt at royal risk management, Harun split the succession between them. Al-Amin would rule as caliph. Al-Ma'mun would govern the eastern provinces, especially Khorasan, with significant autonomy. On paper, it was brilliant, a balance of power that preserved the peace. In practice, it was a fuse. When Harun died in 809, Al-Amin took the throne. For a moment it worked. The ceremonies were observed. The scholars wrote their odes. The coinage bore his name. But ruling an empire is not about ceremonies. It's about insecurity. And Al-Amin, despite his courtly confidence, feared his brother's growing power. By 811, paranoia had bloomed into aggression. Al-Amin declared his own son the successor, effectively cutting Al-Mamun out of the line of succession. It was not a policy move, it was a declaration of war. Al-Mamun, ruling from the east in Merv, responded with the cold efficiency of a man who had waited his entire life for this moment. He declared Al-Amin deposed. Armies marched, and thus began a civil war that would leave the Abbasid Empire cracked and bleeding. The Battle of Rai in 811 went disastrously for Al-Amin. His forces crumbled. Baghdad, once the jewel of Islamic civilization, was besieged by his brother's general, Tahir ibn Hussein. The siege was not swift, it was suffocating. For over a year, the city suffered famine, revolt, and destruction. Al-Amin, once surrounded by scholars and silk, found himself trapped in a palace that no longer listened to his commands. Finally, in 813, he attempted to flee the city disguised, hoping to regroup, perhaps escape, but he was caught near the Tigris River. There was no trial, no negotiation. His captors executed him and sent his severed head to Al-Mamun in a box, a brutal punctuation mark to a fraternal war that had left the empire weakened, its capital in ruins, and its dynasty forever divided. Yet for all the ruthlessness of Al-Amin's end, he at least died quickly. The next ruler would be less fortunate. He had no brothers to fear, no cities to lose, just a tent, a blade, and a circle of officers who finally decided their emperor was no longer worth fearing, only finishing. 14. Nader Shah of Persia. Some rulers fall from grace. Nader Shah of Persia didn't fall. He was pushed by his own men in the dead of night. After years of brilliance curdled into brutality and glory soured into paranoia, his final moment came not with a declaration, but with a quiet knock, a blade in the dark, and the collapse of one of the greatest military minds Persia had ever seen. To understand Nader Shah's death, you have to understand the contradictions that made him, a commoner who rose to be king, a savior of Persia who became its tormentor, a man who won almost every battle he fought, but lost almost every heart he tried to rule. Born in 1688 to a humble family in northeastern Persia, Nader was no blue-blooded aristocrat. His father died when he was a child, and he grew up in hardship, surviving raids, poverty, and displacement. But what he lacked in pedigree, he made up for in sheer military genius. He joined the service of the Safavid remnants, quickly rising through the ranks thanks to his tactical brilliance. When Afghan invaders toppled the Safavid dynasty and chaos spread across Persia, Nader didn't just fight back, he reclaimed the country, one battle at a time. By 1736, Nader had declared himself Shah, founding the Afsharid dynasty, and for a time it worked. His campaigns were legendary. He reconquered lands from India to the Caucasus. His sacking of Delhi in 1739 brought unimaginable wealth back to Persia, including the famed Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor Diamond. He was hailed as the Napoleon of Persia, except he came before Napoleon, and he didn't need revolution to rise, just war. But victory is a poor teacher. As the conquest slowed, Nader's paranoia grew. He saw conspiracies in every corner, betrayal behind every whisper. His former allies became enemies, his soldiers suspects. He imposed harsh taxes to fund his wars. He blinded his own son, fearing a coup. He alienated the nobility, terrified the military, and ruled through fear instead of loyalty. By the end, he trusted no one, and no one trusted him. By 1747, Nader Shah had retreated to a tented encampment in the plains near Khorasan, still nominally in command, still technically untouchable. But his officers, once fiercely loyal, had seen enough. That night, As Nader slept in his tent, a group of them approached silently. They didn't need an army, they just needed a moment. He was stabbed multiple times. The details vary. Some say it was quick, others that he struggled, but in the end, it was final. The man who had brought empires to their knees died on a carpet, in the middle of nowhere, killed by the very soldiers who had once followed him to the ends of the earth. And then the silence. No grand funeral, no golden tomb. His death sparked chaos across the empire. Provinces broke away, generals turned on each other, Persia fractured once more. But while Nader died in his tent, surrounded by steel, the next ruler would die in a cage, literally. A proud sultan, reduced to a prisoner of spectacle, kept alive just long enough to feel the weight of everything he had lost. 15. Bayezid of the Thunderbolt of the Ottoman Empire. In the grand halls of Ottoman history, filled with sultans who expanded borders, crushed rebellions, and commissioned mosques that still scrape the skies, Bayezid I, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt, holds a unique place. His rise was meteoric, his rule formidable, and his end, well, his end reads less like the closing chapter of a heroic epic and more like a political cartoon with a dark punchline. He didn't die in battle, he didn't die in his palace, he died in a cage, literally, and depending on whom you ask, he may have never stopped pacing inside it. Bayezid ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1389 to 1402, a time when the state was still evolving from a frontier beylik into a true imperial power. After the death of his father, Murad I, at the Battle of Kosovo, Bayezid ascended the throne on the battlefield, wasting no time in making his mark. He was swift, militaristic, and ruthless, hence the nickname the Thunderbolt. He conquered Bulgaria, besieged Constantinople, and humiliated European crusaders at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Western knights returned home with fewer limbs and less pride. He moved fast, but he didn't look back. The problem was, someone else was coming. Someone bigger, louder, and even faster. That someone was Timur, better known in the West as Tamerlane. A conqueror from Central Asia, Timur was building his own empire, mowing down cities from India to Syria, with a combination of military brilliance and scorched earth diplomacy. Eventually, two titans, Bayezid and Timur, found themselves on a collision course. Neither wanted to back down. Both believed they were the rightful hegemon of the Islamic world. It was an ego contest backed by cavalry. The inevitable clash came in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara. It was not Bayezid's finest hour. Timur's forces outmaneuvered and outnumbered the Ottomans. Worse, Bayezid's vassals defected mid-battle. His Serbian allies tried to hold the line but were overwhelmed. After a brutal defeat, Bayezid was captured. Not killed, captured, which was in many ways worse. Timur, ever the showman, didn't just imprison Bayezid, he put him in a cage. According to numerous accounts, some embellished, some possibly true, Bayezid was paraded before Timur's court like a rare animal. Some stories claim he was hauled around in an iron cage, exposed to ridicule. Others say he was humiliated in private, forced to watch as his empire crumbled and his family was scattered. To his credit, Bayezid didn't beg. But pride has its limits when your palace becomes a prison. He died a few months later in 1403. Some say it was illness. Others say it was heartbreak, despair, or rage turned inward. Regardless, the man once known as the Thunderbolt died behind bars, with the empire he had built descending into a civil war among his sons. It took the Ottomans nearly a decade to recover. And while Bayezid's cage was made of iron, the next ruler's coffin was crafted of desperation and rot, because even emperors with divine ambitions are no match for decay, and sometimes the smell of death has to be hidden with a basket of fish. 16. Qin Shi Huang of China. Few rulers in world history burned brighter or left behind a stranger legacy than Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He was the architect of the Great Wall's earliest incarnation, the man who melted down enemy weapons to forge statues of glory, and the reason every schoolchild in China knows what standardization means. He unified warring states, crushed dissent, and declared himself not just a king, but the emperor, as in the only one. He also died smelling like fish. Qin Shi Huang's reign, from 221 to 210 BCE, was ambitious to the point of obsession. He didn't just want order, he wanted permanence. He standardized currency, weights, measures, even axle lengths. Yes, axle lengths, so that wagons would fit neatly on state-controlled roads. He built colossal infrastructure, commissioned the terracotta army, and made burning books an official state policy. Because why bother debating ideas when you can incinerate them? And yet, beneath all this iron-fisted efficiency was a man absolutely terrified of dying. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality, not metaphorically, literally. He sent expeditions across seas in search of mythical islands said to harbor the secret to eternal life. He patronized alchemists and charlatans who promised him potions that would cheat death. Ironically, many of these concoctions contained mercury. Because if you're going to gamble with mortality, you may as well do it with poison. By 210 BCE, the emperor was on one of his long imperial tours, essentially a traveling inspection of his empire. These weren't short affairs. He was weeks into his journey, surrounded by ministers and guards, far from the capital of Xianyang, when he suddenly fell ill. Some say it was from heat stroke, others that the mercury finally did its job. Whatever the cause, his health declined rapidly, and then, quietly, inconveniently, he died. Here's the problem. The emperor's death posed an immediate threat to the fragile balance of the newly unified empire. His court feared that if word got out too soon, rebellions would erupt. Rival factions might seize the opportunity. The succession hadn't been clearly communicated, and they were hundreds of miles from the capital. So they did what all pragmatic bureaucrats do when faced with a dead boss and no plan. They lied. The emperor's death was kept secret. His body was placed in a carriage and surrounded by carts filled with salted fish to mask the smell of decomposition. Ministers forged his edicts, issued fake commands, and kept the imperial procession moving toward home as if nothing had happened. The body rotted. The empire continued. Eventually, the corpse made it back to the capital, where he was buried in the enormous mausoleum he had spent decades constructing, an underground complex reportedly guarded by rivers of mercury and 1,000 terracotta soldiers. But even that wasn't enough to protect his legacy. His youngest son, installed via forged imperial orders during the cover-up, proved disastrous. The empire crumbled within years, so the first emperor of China, builder of roads, walls, and empires, died surrounded not by mourning nobles or sacred rituals, but by the odor of decay and a convoy too scared to stop. And if Qin Shi Huang spent his final days trying to outrun mortality, the next emperor died not from hubris or mercury, but from heartbreak. Forced to choose between love and survival, he made his choice with trembling hands and a cord of silk. The crown stayed on, but the heart never recovered. 17. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang. Every empire has its golden age, and every golden age has its shadow. For the Tang dynasty, that golden era shimmered under the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, poet, patron, reformer, and ruler of what many still call China's cultural high point. But his rule also bore the seeds of one of the most devastating rebellions in Chinese history. And at the heart of it all was a woman named Yang Guifei, whose beauty changed the empire, and whose death broke the emperor long before he ever left the throne. Xuanzong ruled from 712 to 756 CE, a remarkable stretch in a time when emperors didn't exactly enjoy lengthy retirements. He began his reign with energy and reform, cutting waste, empowering capable officials, and elevating art and culture to dizzying heights. The Tang capital, Chang'an, became one of the world's largest and most sophisticated cities, buzzing with scholars, traders, and musicians from as far as Persia and Arabia. But as Xuanzong aged, his grip on governance loosened. Into that vacuum stepped Yang Guifei, his favored consort. Technically, she began her palace life married to one of his sons, but she soon caught the emperor's eye. He arranged a convenient divorce, then brought her into his own chambers. From there, she became the most powerful woman in the empire, not officially, not legally, but de facto, undeniably. Xuanzong loved her obsessively. He lavished her with titles, wealth, and influence, so much so that her extended family began securing positions of power throughout the government. Chief among them was her cousin, Yang Guozhong, a man as ambitious as he was politically tone-deaf. His rise through the ranks earned him enemies at court and resentment from the military. Meanwhile, another figure, An Lushan, a frontier general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic origin, was amassing real power on the borders, watching the capital become a theatre of indulgence and distraction. In 755, An Lushan revolted. His rebellion tore through the heart of the empire, capturing Luoyang and threatening Chang'an. The court, stunned and unprepared, fled the capital in haste. On the road to exile, soldiers turned on the emperor, not with blades, but with a demand. Yang Guifei must die. They blamed her, and by extension the emperor, for the chaos. Her cousin had fanned the flames of rebellion, and her influence had clouded imperial judgment. Xuanzong resisted, he begged, but the army would not march another step unless the consort was removed, and so, under duress, the emperor ordered her execution. She was taken aside, away from his eyes, and killed. When the soldiers returned, they told the emperor it was done. They moved on. The dynasty staggered forward. Xuanzong never recovered. He formally abdicated just a few years later, retreating from politics and from life. Though he lived until 762, he never again ruled in spirit. The man who had once been the architect of the Tang Renaissance became a shadow in his own palace. His story ends not with battle or betrayal, but with silence, a broken heart, a legacy cracked in half, one side golden, the other scorched. And while Xuanzong died quietly in his bed, the next emperor would die with a noose of his own making, alone, panicked and cornered by the very city he once ruled, a body hanging from a tree, a capital in flames, and a dynasty blinking out like a candle in the storm. 18. Emperor Chongzhen of Ming. If ever there was a monarch who died trying to hold together a crumbling world with bare hands and sheer will, it was Emperor Chongzhen, the last ruler of the Ming dynasty. His reign, which began with trembling hope in 1627, ended 17 years later, not with a coronation, not with succession, but with a tree branch and a body hanging over a dying empire. But to understand his death, you have to appreciate the size of the catastrophe he inherited. Chongzhen became emperor at the age of 16, thrust into power after the sudden death of his elder brother, the Tianqi emperor, whose own reign had been dominated by the infamous eunuch Wei Zhongxian. The imperial court was a snake pit of corruption, sycophancy, and infighting. The treasury was empty, the borders were porous, and the people, tired of taxes, tired of bandits, tired of promises. And yet, Chongzhen tried. He removed Wei Zhongxian and his cronies. He attempted to cut corruption. He reinstated some competent officials. He slashed imperial expenditures. On paper, he did everything a reforming emperor is supposed to do. But by the time Chongzhen arrived at the helm, the Ming dynasty was already in its death spiral. The court had rotted too long, the coffers were too dry, the system too brittle. As the 1630s gave way to the 1640s, China was hit with a 1-2 punch of environmental disaster and social unrest. Famines devastated northern provinces. Floods and droughts alternated like cruel jokes. Peasant rebellions flared, especially under Li Zicheng, a former postal worker turned rebel leader who became the face of everything the dynasty couldn't control. Meanwhile, in the northeast, the Manchus, once considered just another border tribe, were consolidating power, watching with quiet calculation as the Ming flailed. By 1644, Li Zicheng's army had swept through central China, and his forces were advancing on Beijing. Chongzhen, still clinging to his throne, summoned the court. There was no aid coming, no allies left. The capital was cut off. Even his own generals hesitated to respond to imperial commands. One by one, his options vanished. On April 24th, as rebel troops entered the capital, Chongzhen moved through the Forbidden City, reportedly dressed in mourning robes. He ordered his concubines and family members to take their own lives, whether to spare them humiliation or to preserve some twisted sense of dynastic dignity remains debated. The emperor then left the palace alone, walking to Meishan, a small hill behind the compound. There, under a gnarled tree, he took off his robe, scrawled a final message blaming himself for the fall of the empire, and ended his life. When Li Zicheng's troops found him, they didn't even know who he was. His body was mutilated, stripped of insignia, barely recognizable. The last Ming emperor, once the son of heaven, was reduced to just another casualty in a city choking on smoke and sorrow. And though his dynasty ended in that moment, the empire didn't. The Manchus soon swept in, forming the Qing. Beijing was rebuilt. A new emperor sat on the throne, but Chongzhen was never replaced. His throne remained symbolically empty, a ghost where a ruler had once stood. But if his end was marked by despair, the next king died by absurdity, a royal founder gored by an animal he never saw coming. In a twist of fate so brutal and bizarre, it reads more like a myth than a biography. 19. King Anorata of Pagan. In the great mosaic of Southeast Asian history, King Anorata of Pagan is remembered as a nation builder, a temple patron, and the founder of the first Burmese empire. His name lives on in chronicles, in the monumental stupas of Bagan, and in the national imagination of Myanmar. He unified kingdoms, spread Theravada Buddhism, and created the political foundation for what would become modern Burma. And then, quite suddenly, he was killed by a buffalo. If ever a royal death felt like a footnote scrawled in disbelief, this is it. After a lifetime of conquest and consolidation, Anorata's end came not by blade or betrayal, but by hooves. Not at the gates of a fortress, but in the countryside. It was, depending on how you look at it, a tragic accident or the world's most ironic punchline. Born around 1014, Anorata came to power in 1044 after what was, by the standards of the time, a relatively tidy coup. He overthrew his brother to claim the throne, setting the tone for a reign marked by ambition and ferocity. Within a few years, he had transformed the pagan kingdom from a regional power into a formidable state that absorbed its neighbors through both war and diplomacy. But Anorata's legacy wasn't just military. He embraced Theravada Buddhism after encountering the Mon monk Shin Arahan, and quickly made it the official religion of his court. He imported scriptures, commissioned temples, and launched campaigns to purge the country of what he saw as heretical practices. The plains of Bagan, now dotted with thousands of ancient temples, owe much of their beauty to his religious fervor and imperial resources. He was also, by most accounts, tireless. He led military campaigns personally. He traveled across his kingdom. He involved himself in infrastructure and governance, which is perhaps why his death feels so surreal. According to Burmese chronicles, Anorata died in 1077, not during a battle or political crisis, but during a royal procession or hunting trip. Sources differ slightly. While traveling, he encountered a wild buffalo. Accounts claim it gored him fatally. Not a war elephant, not a rebel soldier, a buffalo. the kind of animal that most kings wouldn't even notice until it was served on a platter. This wasn't just a tragic accident. In many traditional interpretations, it became symbolic. A wild beast felling a king was interpreted by some as karmic justice, a ruler brought down by the very nature he had spent decades trying to bend to his will. Others took it as a sign that even the mightiest are subject to the most unpredictable ends. That power can command armies, build temples, rewrite religious doctrine, but it can't stop a charging animal in the wrong place at the wrong time. His death sent ripples through the pagan court. Though he had a successor, King Lu, the kingdom would soon face instability and civil unrest. As strong as Anorata's foundations were, they couldn't shield the empire from the chaos that tends to follow a monarch's sudden and absurd exit. But at least Anorata's legacy was preserved in temples and stone. The next royal would die defending his palace against foreign invaders, only for his body to be ransacked, looted, and left as a trophy in the ruins of his fallen fortress. 20. Tipu, Sultan of Mysore. History remembers Tipu Sultan as the Tiger of Mysore, a warrior king who stared down colonial forces with a kind of stubborn fury that made him both feared and admired. He modernized his army, minted his own coins, corresponded with foreign powers like Napoleon, and absolutely refused, to kneel to British rule. And for that, he paid the price. Not just with his life, but with a posthumous humiliation that echoed louder than the cannon that killed him. Tipu's rule from 1782 to 1799 was a brief but explosive chapter in South Asian history. He inherited the throne after the death of his father, Hyder Ali, a former military commander who had risen through the ranks to become ruler of Mysore. Together, father and son had challenged the British East India Company long before it became fashionable to do so. Tipu wasn't simply resisting imperialism, he was trying to write an entirely different future for India. Under Tipu, Mysore became one of the most militarily and economically advanced states on the subcontinent. He introduced modern rocketry, yes, actual metal cylinder rockets that predated European versions by decades. He built roads and irrigation networks, expanded trade with the Ottoman Empire and France, and reinforced his Islamic credentials while still employing Hindus in high administrative positions. Pragmatism and pride defined his rule. But pride, in an age of encroaching empire, was dangerous. The British saw Tipu as a threat, not just militarily but symbolically. He was the embodiment of Indian resistance, well-armed, well-organized, and deeply unwilling to make concessions. After two inconclusive Anglo-Mysore wars, and one that nearly crushed the company's reputation, the British had had enough. In 1799, they joined forces with the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas to mount a final overwhelming assault on Mysore. The prize was Srirangapatna, Tipu's capital. The siege was brutal. Tipu, unlike many rulers of the time, chose to fight on the front lines. On May the 4th, 1799, British troops breached the city walls. Street by street fighting broke out. Tipu, wounded but still standing, made his last stand near the gate of his palace. When it was over, his body was discovered among the fallen, dressed in armor, sword in hand. And then the looting began. The British ransacked the city, Tipu's personal possessions, his ornate throne, his swords, his journals, his legendary mechanical tiger that growled when its crank was turned, were taken as trophies. His palace was stripped, his treasury was emptied. The tiger of Mysore was reduced to spoils of war, his body eventually buried in a mausoleum nearby, but his image paraded through London and Calcutta as proof that resistance was futile. What makes Tipu's death so haunting isn't just that he died defending his capital, it's how quickly his identity was repackaged. In life, he had been a sovereign ruler, a thorn in the side of empire, military innovator. In death, he was used as a cautionary tale, This is what happens when you resist too hard, too long. But even the most defiant warriors can't outlast betrayal from within. And the next royal would learn that sometimes the knife comes not from an invading force, but from your own blood, waiting in the shadows. 21. Shaka Zulu. In the sweeping saga of southern Africa's history, few names loom as large or as violently as Shaka Zulu. He was a military genius, a reformer, and a revolutionary who forged the Zulu kingdom from a scattering of small clans into a centralized powerhouse. He redefined warfare, reshaped society, and made his name feared across vast stretches of land. But like so many rulers who climb high and fast, Shaka's downfall came not from foreign invaders or battlefield defeats, but from something closer, colder, and infinitely more personal: family. Shaka was born around 1787, the illegitimate son of Senzanga, a minor chief of the Zulu clan, and Nandi, a woman whose resilience would shape her son's rise. Shunned in his youth, mocked for his background, Shaka was forged in fire, an outsider with something to prove, and the kind of memory that never forgot a slight. He served under the powerful Mthethwa king Dingiswayo, where his talents as a warrior and strategist quickly rose to the surface. After Dingiswayo's death, Shaka didn't just step into a leadership vacuum, he created a throne where none had existed. By the 1810s, Shaka had transformed the Zulu military into a disciplined and terrifying force. He replaced the throwing spear with the ikolwa, a short, stabbing spear used in close combat, and introduced the bullhorn formation, a flanking maneuver that crushed enemy formations with ruthless efficiency. Under Shaka's command, small battles became total wars. Clans were absorbed, scattered, or annihilated. Refugees fled in every direction, triggering a chain reaction of upheavals known as the Mfikane, the crushing. Shaka's name wasn't just known, it was unavoidable. But greatness has its costs. Shaka's obsession with control extended beyond the battlefield. He demanded absolute loyalty. He ruled through fear as much as admiration. His punishments were severe, and his inner circle, while powerful, knew they were never far from falling out of favor. Then came the death of his mother, Nandi, in 1827. Grief does strange things to powerful men, and for Shaka, it seemed to open a deep, unhealable wound. Accounts, many written by European colonists with their own biases, describe a ruler slipping into erratic and paranoid behavior. He imposed harsh mourning rituals across his kingdom. Crops were not to be planted, milk was not to be consumed, pregnancies were forbidden. The entire Zulu nation, it seemed, was ordered to mourn with the intensity of a son who had just lost his anchor. This became the breaking point. His half-brothers, Dingain and Mochlangana, began to move quietly. With the help of trusted insiders, they plotted to remove the king whose grief had made him unpredictable. In 1828, the trap was sprung. Shaka was ambushed, quickly, methodically. There was no public rebellion, no great insurrection, just a sudden end. The king was dead. His body was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near present-day Kwadukuza. His brothers assumed the throne, but the kingdom Shaka built would never be quite the same. His military legacy endured, but his empire, like so many built by charisma and force of will, began to shift, fragment, and eventually fall under colonial pressure. And if Shaka's death was a betrayal from within, the next emperor's was a death by foreign bullet and brutal aftermath, a battlefield, a mortal wound, and enemies who didn't stop when he fell. They made sure to erase him, one mutilation at a time. 22. Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia. Of all the emperors to sit upon the lion throne of Ethiopia, Johannes IV remains one of the most fascinatingly tragic. He was a unifier, a warrior, and a deeply devout Christian who held his fragile empire together through sheer will, diplomatic cunning, and relentless military vigilance. And in the end, it was that same sense of duty to protect his homeland at any cost that led him to a battlefield in the mountains of modern-day Eritrea, where his final act was as brutal as it was loyal. Johannes IV ruled from 1872 until his death in 1889, during a time when Ethiopia was surrounded by pressures on all sides. The late 19th century was not a forgiving moment for African sovereignty. European powers were scrambling for colonies across the continent, redrawing maps with little concern for the people who lived on them. The Ottomans were still lingering in the north. The Egyptians were flexing their muscles. The Mahdists of Sudan were on the rise. And Italy, an uninvited but eager guest in the colonial scramble, had begun eyeing the Red Sea coast. Johannes had inherited not a nation, but a puzzle of regional rulers, religious factions, and rival noble families. His early reign was defined by civil wars and power struggles, as he fought to assert central control and restore the imperial dignity of a fractured kingdom. But unlike many rulers of the era, he never lost sight of the bigger picture. He saw clearly what was coming: external conquest disguised as diplomacy. He fought wars against the Egyptians and pushed them back. He kept the British Empire at bay through calculated alliances. And when the Mahdist forces from Sudan began to raid Ethiopian territory, Johannes did what he had always done. He rode out to face them himself. It was 1889, and the Mahdist movement, an Islamic revivalist force that had recently overthrown Anglo-Egyptian control in Sudan, had become one of the most dangerous powers in northeast Africa. Their incursions into Ethiopian territory had grown bold, and Johannes, by now an aging but battle-hardened emperor, marched north to confront them at the Battle of Galabat. The fighting was fierce. The Ethiopian army, though less equipped than the Mahdists, fought with unshakable resolve. Johannes himself entered the fray, leading from the front, dressed not as a distant monarch but as a soldier king. During the battle, he was struck by a bullet. Accounts vary on the moment. Some say he stayed conscious for a time, continuing to give orders. Others claim he died quickly. What is certain is that when the Mahdists realized the emperor had fallen, they didn't retreat. They advanced. His body, captured by enemy soldiers, was not returned. Reports suggest it was mutilated, paraded, and desecrated. The man who had spent his reign defending Ethiopia from external conquest was denied even the dignity of burial in his own land. His soldiers, disoriented and leaderless, eventually withdrew. The Ethiopian crown passed into another power struggle. Johannes IV had lived by a simple rule, that Ethiopia must remain unbroken. He died upholding it. But the violence of his death and the callous way his enemies treated his remains left a scar on the empire, one that would not fully heal until Ethiopia, decades later, repelled another European invasion. And while Johannes died on the battlefield, the next king's death was slower, quieter, and riddled with mystery, a descent into illness and strange symptoms that left historians debating whether it was poison, divine punishment, or simply the cruel price of crossing too many gods. 23. King Nzinga Nkuwu of Congo. The history of Africa's great pre-colonial kingdoms is often filtered through the narrow lens of European conquest, but long before foreign flags were planted on its soil, the Kingdom of Congo was already thriving, sophisticated, centralized, and deeply entangled in its own questions of power, belief, and identity. At the center of one of its most pivotal transitions was King Nzinga Nkuwu, a ruler who tried to bridge two worlds, the ancient traditions of his people and the foreign doctrines of a new rising power. His reward? A death as ambiguous and unsettling as the political gamble that preceded it. Nzinga Nkuwu ruled the Kingdom of Congo from the late 1470s until his death in 1506, during one of the most transformative periods in African history. His reign began in the final decades of the 15th century, just as Portuguese ships began hugging the West African coast. not as explorers, but as emissaries of commerce, religion, and empire. At first, Nzinga welcomed them. The Portuguese offered goods, firearms, advisors, and, most importantly, a new kind of spiritual currency. In 1491, Nzinga made the controversial decision to convert to Christianity. He was baptized with much ceremony as Xuan I, adopting the name of Portugal's king. This act, symbolic and political, was seen by many as a shrewd move. Aligning himself with a European power gave Nzinga access to technology, trade routes, and legitimacy on the global stage. It also helped him consolidate power at home, as the Christian faith gave him new tools to wield in the delicate dance of Congo's noble factions. But not everyone in his kingdom agreed with the shift. Nzinga's embrace of Christianity introduced deep tension between the traditionalist elements of Congo's nobility and those eager to align with Portuguese influence. Conversion wasn't just about a change in belief, it meant adopting new rituals, new laws, and new alliances. Christianity brought with it ideas about divine kingship and monogamy that directly contradicted Congo's social norms. It threatened local priests, disrupted ancestral traditions, and opened the door to foreign interference. Even within the royal family, divisions deepened. Nzinga's health began to decline in the early 1500s. Records from the period are murky, but chroniclers, particularly Portuguese missionaries, describe him as suffering from a mysterious illness, a slow physical and mental deterioration that no one could clearly diagnose. Was it poisoning? Sabotage from traditionalists? A withdrawal of support from the spirits his ancestors had once honored? Or perhaps just the natural toll of age and political exhaustion? He died in 1506, leaving behind a kingdom divided not by civil war, but by ideology. The succession passed to his son, Afonso Vuz, who was even more devoutly Christian and more aggressive in aligning with the Portuguese crown. Congo's fate was sealed, its future tied irrevocably to the tides of European interest, the church, and eventually the transatlantic slave trade. Nzinga's death marked the end of an era, not with swords or rebellion, but with silence, discomfort, and the slow erosion of certainty. A king who tried to be both priest and politician, native and foreign, sacred and strategic, only to discover that the body can't always survive what the soul tries to stretch. And while Nzinga died surrounded by questions, the next queen wrote her own ending with theatrical finality, an icon of seduction, defiance, and imperial ruin, whose death became one of the most mythologized exits in history. 24. Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Few figures in history have been more mythologized or misunderstood than Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She has been called a seductress, a strategist, a goddess, a traitor, and a patriot. But whatever version you believe, her death in 30 BCE remains one of the most iconic and symbolically loaded departures from power ever recorded. It was the final gasp of Egyptian sovereignty, the last chapter of the Hellenistic age, and the moment when a queen's calculated performance met its irreversible conclusion. Cleopatra came to the throne in 51 BCE, co-ruling first with her brother Ptolemy XIII and later with other family members in a dynastic dance choreographed more by incest and assassinations than orderly succession. The Ptolemies were not Egyptians by blood. They were Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, but Cleopatra was the first of her line to actually learn the Egyptian language and embrace her role not just as queen, but as divine pharaoh. Her reign was marked by turbulence from the beginning. Egypt, though wealthy and culturally rich, was increasingly dependent on the Roman Republic for protection and trade. Cleopatra understood that power now lived not in the Nile, but in Rome. So she did what any savvy ruler might do. She played Rome against itself. First, Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. These weren't just liaisons of lust or vanity, they were alliances. Cleopatra used her intelligence, charisma, and political savvy to survive in a game where almost everyone else was being eliminated. She gave Caesar a son. She gave Antony ships and soldiers. She hosted them in Alexandria like a goddess hosting gods. But Rome, especially in its dying republican days, didn't take kindly to queens who acted like emperors. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra backed Antony in his conflict with Octavian, the future Augustus. Together, she and Antony dreamed of a new Eastern Empire, one that could rival Rome in splendor and power. They wagered everything on the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. And they lost. The aftermath was swift. Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony, misinformed that Cleopatra had died, took his own life. Cleopatra, still alive and cornered in her palace, now had a choice: surrender to Octavian and be paraded through Rome as a conquered monarch, or die on her own terms. She chose the latter. The exact method of her death has been debated for centuries. The most famous account claims she used an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, to end her life, dying in her royal chambers, dressed in her finest robes, flanked by loyal attendants who followed her into death. Other theories suggest poison disguised as a comb or a concoction hidden in her jewelry. The details are murky. What matters more is the symbolism. Cleopatra's death wasn't just an escape, it was a performance. One final act of sovereignty in a world that no longer had room for queens. Octavian found her body and buried her beside Antony, honoring her wish even as he absorbed her kingdom into the Roman Empire. Egypt, for the first time in millennia, no longer belonged to itself. And while Cleopatra turned her death into legend, the next king would be offered no such dignity. His end came not in silk and gold, but in betrayal and blood. Cut down during revolt, his body left to the fury of those who once called him king. 25. King Sekhwati II of the Pedi. The death of King Sekhwati II of the Pedi, a relatively lesser-known African monarch, doesn't come with the weight of world empires or golden legends. His kingdom did not fall with a blaze of cannon fire or a famous betrayal immortalized in stone. His demise occurred in the quiet corners of South African history, during a time when colonial pressures, tribal rivalries, and internal strife converged into something far more insidious than open war: political invisibility. Sekhwati II ruled over the Pedi Kingdom, a once formidable power in the northeastern highlands of what is now South Africa. The Pedi had, under previous kings like Sekhukhune II, resisted both Zulu expansion and British imperial ambitions with grit and resilience. They maintained a degree of sovereignty during a period when most African kingdoms were being carved up like meat at a European banquet table. The infamous scramble for Africa. But by the late 19th century, the Pedi were under severe strain. After Sekhukhune I's capture and the kingdom's brief collapse following British intervention in 1879, internal leadership became fractured. The traditional power structures eroded. Sekhwati II came to rule during this confusing and dangerous interregnum, when the British had technically dismantled the Pedi chieftaincy, but local leadership continued to operate, partially sanctioned, partially underground, always at risk. Sekhwati II wasn't an emperor. He was a local king trying to hold on to dignity and authority, while colonial administrators installed their own preferred leaders, monitored communications, and undermined tribal structures. To be a king under such conditions was to live constantly between two worlds, one defined by ancestral law, the other by the ticking of European clocks and typewritten decrees. By the time Sekhwati II faced revolt within his own ranks, the kingdom had become a shadow of what it once was. Like many African leaders caught in the snare of both foreign and domestic unrest, he was tasked with managing tensions from every side, rival factions who saw him as weak, British officials who saw him as irrelevant, and a population that was losing faith in monarchy altogether. The revolt that led to his death was not a grand civil war. It was a calculated act by rival chiefs and disaffected subordinates who saw in Sekhwati's fading power an opportunity. According to oral traditions and colonial dispatches, he was betrayed during a gathering meant to signal unity. Instead, it became a trap. Sekhwati too was killed, reportedly ambushed and overpowered in a swift internal coup. His body was not laid to rest with royal rites, but desecrated by rivals as a warning to others. There were no statues built, no monuments commissioned. His legacy was left to oral memory, scattered across generations and distorted by time. His death marked more than the end of a man. It signaled the terminal decline of petty sovereignty. British colonial administrators filled the vacuum with tribal authorities of their own choosing. The kingdom remained in name, but its core had been gutted, its authority bought, broken, or buried. Sekhwati too died not because he lost a war, but because he no longer fit the map that others were drawing. And while his death faded into historical obscurity, the next monarch's fall would shake two continents. A god-king held for ransom by foreign invaders, strangled despite the mountains of gold offered to spare him, proving once and for all that even entire empires can't negotiate with conquest. 26. Atahualpa, Inca Emperor. When Atahualpa, the last sovereign emperor of the Inca Empire, met the Spanish conquistadors in 1532, he was at the height of his power. His armies had just crushed a civil war, his rivals lay dead or scattered, and he stood as the undisputed ruler of the largest empire in the Americas. He had never seen a horse, he had never heard a gunshot, and yet, within months, he would be executed, strangled at the hands of a few hundred foreign invaders, after offering what may have been the most expensive ransom in human history. Atahualpa's rise to power was, like many royal stories, born in blood. He was the son of Huayna Capac, an Inca emperor who had ruled a vast domain stretching from modern-day Colombia to central Chile. But Huayna's death in the late 1520s sparked a devastating civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother Huascar, who both claimed the throne. For years, the empire tore itself apart in a conflict that killed tens of thousands. Atahualpa emerged victorious, capturing Huascar and consolidating power just as the Spanish were making their first cautious steps into Inca territory. Enter Francisco Pizarro. In November 1532, Pizarro and fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers lured Atahualpa into a meeting in the town of Cajamarca under the pretense of diplomacy. The emperor arrived unarmed, surrounded by thousands of attendants, confident in his power and position. After all, he had just defeated his most dangerous enemy. These foreigners, he assumed, were guests, perhaps even potential allies. They were not. The Spanish ambushed Atahualpa's retinue, slaughtering hundreds in a surprise attack. Cannons thundered, horses charged, and steel cut through fabric and flesh alike. Amid the chaos, Atahualpa was captured. He would never see freedom again. The conquistadors understood the value of a captive emperor. Atahualpa was held in a room and promised his life in exchange for a ransom, one that would become the stuff of legend. He pledged to fill a room with gold and 2 more with silver, all up to shoulder height. Over the next months, temples were stripped, idols melted down, and artisans' works were reduced to ingots. The Inca elite watched as their sacred objects were turned into currency for a king's survival. But gold doesn't buy trust. By mid-1533, despite the ransom being nearly fulfilled, the Spanish began to fear Atahualpa's influence. He still commanded loyalty, he still held symbolic power. Rumors swirled that he was plotting an uprising. Whether these fears were based on fact or colonial paranoia hardly mattered. The conclusion had already been drawn. On August the 29th, 1533, Atahualpa was brought before a hastily arranged tribunal. He was found guilty of conspiracy and sentenced to death. The Spanish gave him a choice: accept Christian baptism and he would be spared burning, executed instead by garrote, a slower but less publicly horrifying death. He agreed. He was baptized and then quietly strangled. No rebellion ever came. His execution marked not just the end of a man, but the symbolic fall of an entire civilization. The Inca Empire, already weakened by disease and internal strife, collapsed soon after. The Spanish marched on Cusco, the imperial capital, and within a generation, centuries of culture, tradition, and imperial authority were consumed by the machinery of European conquest. And while Atahualpa died under the weight of betrayal and ransom, the next emperor would fall in chaos and contradiction, killed either by his enemies or his own people, depending on which version you believe. A ruler blamed by everyone, mourned by no one, and caught between gods, guns, and history. 27. Moctezuma II of the Aztecs. Few royal deaths are more contested, more clouded by suspicion, shame, and selective memory than that of Moctezuma II, the last fully sovereign emperor of the Aztec Empire. His reign began in grandeur, with temples blazing and tribute pouring in from all directions. It ended in utter humiliation, with his name shouted in anger, his image shattered by his own people, and his body cast aside during the darkest hour in his empire's history. When Moctezuma took the throne in 1502, the Aztec Empire was at its peak. Centered in Tenochtitlan, a sprawling island city that dazzled even its enemies, the empire ruled over vast territories through military dominance and a complex network of vassal states. Moctezuma himself was a deeply religious man, highly educated and known for his disciplined lifestyle, but he also ruled with a heavy hand. His centralization of power and frequent use of fear as a tool had begun to stir quiet resentment among the nobility and commoners alike. Still, his authority was absolute, until the ships came. In 1519, Hernan Cortes landed on the Gulf Coast with a few hundred Spanish soldiers and a few dozen horses, both completely unknown to the Aztecs. Moctezuma received word of their arrival through his network of scouts and messengers. What he heard disturbed him. These strange bearded men wore metal, rode beasts, and fired thunder from sticks. Some sources say he believed they were divine, or at least connected to prophecy. Others claim he saw them as foreign kings, whose power could perhaps be co-opted through diplomacy and gifts. Whatever he believed, his initial response was one of caution. He sent emissaries, offered gold, and watched from afar. But gold, to the Spanish, wasn't a diplomatic gesture. It was a declaration of weakness. It confirmed everything they hoped. This land was rich, and its rulers could be manipulated. By the time Cortes and his army reached Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma did what no Aztec emperor before him had done. He allowed a foreign army into the capital. He welcomed them as guests, housed them in the palace of Xuanzong, and tried to manage them with etiquette and offerings. Instead, the Spanish took him hostage. From that moment forward, Moctezuma ruled in name only. He became a puppet, issuing orders under duress while the Spanish plotted and raided temples. His people grew restless. His nobility seethed. The gods, it seemed, had gone silent. In 1520, tensions exploded. After a massacre at the Toxcatl festival, the city erupted in revolt. The people of Tenochtitlan turned on their Spanish occupiers and on Moctezuma. They no longer saw him as their divine protector. He had become a symbol of capitulation. Here's where history fractures. Spanish sources claim that Moctezuma was brought to the palace rooftop to calm the crowd and was struck down by a hail of stones thrown by his own people. He died shortly after from his injuries. Aztec sources say, otherwise, that he had already been murdered by the Spanish, either by blade or bludgeon, and that his death was disguised as a popular uprising to deflect blame. In either version, the truth is ugly. Moctezuma died unloved, unmourned, and unmoored from the power he once embodied. The Spanish fled the city shortly after in what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But the damage was done. Moctezuma was dead. Tenochtitlan would fall the next year, and an empire built on centuries of belief collapsed in a matter of months. But if Moctezuma's end was a blend of betrayal and public fury, the next emperor's fate was quieter, but no less final, cut down by men who once followed him, in the streets of a city born from revolution, where liberty had been promised and quickly forgotten. 28. Emperor Charles of Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He liberated a nation, destroyed an empire, and then, just 2 years after declaring himself Emperor of Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines was assassinated in the streets by men who had once marched beside him. His death wasn't just the end of a ruler. It was the unraveling of the dream he had fought so violently to make real, an independent black republic, free from European rule, standing tall on the ashes of colonialism. Instead, it fractured, it bled, and it began with a corpse lying in the dust of Port-au-Prince. Dessalines was not born a king. He was born enslaved somewhere in the West African descended plantations of Saint-Domingue, the French colony that would become Haiti. He labored in sugarcane fields, endured beatings, and learned early that survival in the New World demanded more than obedience. It required strategy. When the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791, Dessalines joined the uprising, initially under the command of Toussaint Louverture, whose military brilliance helped push back both French and foreign powers. But when Louverture was captured by the French and shipped off to die in a freezing prison in the Jura Mountains, it was Dessalines who picked up the mantle. He reorganized the army, played the European powers against one another, and turned his sights on full independence. In 1804, after routing Napoleon's forces and declaring victory, he proclaimed Haiti a free nation, the first black republic in the modern world. A nation of the formerly enslaved, born in fire and refusal. Dessalines crowned himself emperor that same year. It was not a symbolic act. He believed Haiti needed a strong hand to survive in a hostile world. Surrounded by slave-holding colonies and European skepticism, he sought to fortify the revolution by centralizing authority. He took on the title Jacques V, Emperor of Haiti, and began implementing reforms that prioritized national security, economic production, and state control. But his reign was not universally admired. Dessalines ruled with intensity and suspicion. His administration included land redistribution policies that alienated parts of the black elite and threatened the mixed-race gens de couleur, many of whom had their own visions for Haiti's future, less imperial, more cosmopolitan. His land policies disrupted privilege, his military presence ever visible, unsettled former allies. Whispers of dissent began to circulate among the very generals who had once saluted him. In 1806, during what should have been an ordinary journey to quell local unrest, Dessalines was ambushed near Pont-l'Anage, just outside Port-au-Prince. The conspiracy included some of his closest officers, Alexandre Pétion and Henri Christophe, two towering figures of the revolution. The ambush was quick, shots fired, the emperor fell. His body was reportedly left exposed in the street, a signal to all that his reign had ended, not with a coronation, but with a reckoning. No imperial funeral, no grand tomb, just silence and the slow turning of the political tide. Pétion would go on to lead the Southern Republic of Haiti, while Christophe would rule the north as king, a monarch in his own right. The revolutionary state Dessalines had envisioned split almost immediately after his death. His legacy remains deeply polarizing. To some, he was a tyrant, undone by his own severity. To others, he was a martyr, murdered for daring to imagine a world where the formerly enslaved could rule themselves without apology. And while Dessalines died in the streets of a nation he helped birth, the next monarch's end would come not by bullet or blade, but by breath, stolen quietly, invisibly, by a pandemic that cared nothing for crowns, titles, or thrones. 29. King Tupou of Tonga. By the time King Tupou II took the throne in 1893, the Kingdom of Tonga had already done the unthinkable, preserved its sovereignty in a region being swallowed by empires. While much of Polynesia had fallen under British, French, or American colonial control, Tonga remained the only Pacific island nation never formally colonized. That miracle, however, did not come cheaply. It came through treaties, diplomacy, strategic subordination, and the maintenance of a monarchy that walked a tightrope between tradition and appeasement. Tupou II inherited that balancing act, and in the end failed to keep his footing. His death in 1918, during the final wave of the Spanish flu pandemic, might appear at first glance to be unremarkable. There were no assassinations, no coups, no melodramatic royal intrigues, no final battle, no betrayal, just illness, just breath fading. But in the context of Tonga's history, and in the cruel irony of his life's trajectory, Tupou II's death marked more than the end of a reign. It was the symbolic collapse of a royal identity that had tried desperately and unsuccessfully to prove it could coexist with modernity. Tupou II was the grandson of King George Tupou I, the fierce and shrewd founder of modern Tonga, who had unified the islands and negotiated the nation's delicate independence. George I had left a legacy of centralized authority, constitutional monarchy, and Christian reform that would define Tongan politics for generations. By the time Tupou II ascended the throne, those foundations were beginning to tremble. He was young, just 19, and untested when he inherited the crown. And from the beginning, he was beset by conflict. Internally, there was growing discontent among the chiefs and nobility, many of whom resented his centralization of power. He was seen as indecisive, inconsistent, and overly influenced by his inner circle. Externally, Tonga was under increasing pressure from colonial powers, particularly Britain, which had signed a treaty of friendship with Tonga, but operated under the assumption that friendship meant eventual control. Under Tupou II, Tonga's government became tangled in scandal, debt, and political missteps. His decision to marry Lavinia Vayongo, a woman from a noble family not favored by certain factions, triggered protests and even civil unrest. Eventually, he was forced to remarry to appease political tensions, a symbolic surrender to the aristocracy that had long distrusted his leadership. In 1900, to avoid annexation and maintain a semblance of autonomy, Tonga was declared a British protected state. While the monarchy was preserved, foreign control seeped into the machinery of government. British advisors gained influence. The royal court began to feel less like a throne room and more like a colonial outpost with ceremonial frills. Tupou II remained king in name, but sovereignty, once absolute, had become conditional. And so by the time the Spanish flu arrived in 1918, the king was already a diminished figure. The pandemic struck Tonga with horrifying speed. The island kingdom, like much of the Pacific, had no immunity to the virus. The first reported cases arrived in early November, and within weeks thousands were sick. Entire villages were paralyzed, burial grounds filled. Nearly 8% of the population died in just a few short weeks, a demographic collapse so rapid it warped the nation's memory. Tupou II, already in poor health, succumbed to the flu on April 5, 1918, at the relatively young age of 43. He died not in battle or political defeat, but quietly, in the company of caregivers unable to save him from a virus that didn't care who wore crowns. There were no grand farewells, no state funeral with the full pageantry of the Pacific royal tradition. just masks, confusion, and exhaustion. His death passed almost as a side note to the larger tragedy swallowing his people. But in that death lay a bitter irony. Tupou, too, had spent his reign trying to walk the line between royal tradition and modern governance, between Tongan independence and British interference, between divine kingship and mortal fallibility. And in the end, it wasn't political opposition that defeated him. It was the cold hand of a global pandemic, one that erased distinctions between chiefs and commoners, kings and subjects. His daughter, Queen Salote Tupou III, would later become one of the most beloved monarchs in Pacific history, rebuilding the Tongan monarchy's image and leading the nation through decades of change. But she did so under the long shadow of her father's failures and the quiet, devastating way in which he exited the world stage. And if Tupou II died in bed, wrapped in colonial fabric and viral silence, the next emperor would face a far louder end. A firing squad, a borrowed crown, and the echo of distant drums, marking the final act of an empire built on foreign soil and collapsing under the weight of its own delusions. 30. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Few deaths in royal history are as steeped in irony, tragedy, and political theatre as that of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Born an Austrian archduke in the opulent courts of Europe, Maximilian lived most of his life in palaces, gardens, and academic circles, far removed from the dusty plains and revolutionary politics of mid-19th century Mexico. He was a dreamer, a romantic, a believer in enlightened monarchy, and in the end, that idealism cost him everything. His execution by firing squad in 1867 wasn't just the fall of a foreign-imposed monarch, it was a spectacular collapse of imperial hubris, international manipulation, and one man's fatally misplaced sense of destiny. Maximilian's end was slow in coming, well publicized and ultimately inescapable. He died not only because he was on the wrong side of history, but because he was never really in control of the script at all. Born in 1832 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Ferdinand Maximilian was the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. As the spare heir in a family of rulers, Maximilian embraced a life of exploration, naval command, and liberal ideals. He was intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and enamored with the idea of constitutional monarchy. In another world, he might have remained an archduke with a modest role in the machinery of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in the chaotic geopolitical environment of the 1860s, he was offered a role he could not resist, emperor of a country he had never set foot in. The opportunity came via Napoleon III of France, who, in one of the more elaborate geopolitical gambits of the 19th century, decided to install a European monarch in Mexico. The plan was deceptively simple. Mexico, recently torn apart by civil war and burdened with foreign debt, was ripe for stabilization. France, along with Spain and Britain, initially launched a joint intervention. But Napoleon had grander ambitions. He would make Mexico a monarchy, friendly to European interests, and place a Habsburg on the throne to give it legitimacy. Maximilian, flattered and convinced he had a divine role to play in uplifting the Mexican people, accepted the offer. He arrived in Mexico in 1864 with his wife Carlota and a full imperial entourage. But what he didn't realize, or chose to ignore, was that the Mexican Republic, led by Benito Juarez, was still very much alive and opposed to foreign rule. Maximilian was not stepping into a vacant throne. He was occupying a nation under military enforcement. For a while, he played the part with elegance. He toured cities, issued progressive reforms, attempted to mediate land disputes, and tried to win over the population. He spoke of Mexican identity, of unity, of justice, but his rule was a mirage. Outside the cities, Republican forces continued to resist. Maximilian depended entirely on French military support. And when Napoleon III pulled his troops out in 1866, under pressure from the United States and mounting costs, the illusion crumbled. Maximilian had a chance to flee. His European supporters begged him to return home. Even his loyal wife Carlota sailed to Europe to plead for aid from European courts, suffering a mental breakdown in the process that left her institutionalized for the rest of her life. But Maximilian stayed. Why? Some say it was honor, others say it was pride. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could hold the empire together with dignity. Perhaps he simply couldn't bear the shame of running away. In 1867, Republican forces surrounded his last stronghold in Querétaro. After a brief siege and a failed escape attempt, Maximilian was captured and put on trial for treason, not just as a foreign invader, but as a usurper who had ordered executions during his reign. Despite international appeals for clemency, including pleas from Victor Hugo, Queen Victoria, and even the United States, President Juarez refused to commute the sentence. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian was led to a firing squad alongside his two loyal generals, Miguel Miramon and Tomás Mejía. Dressed in a black suit and white gloves, Maximilian reportedly handed each soldier a gold coin, asking them not to shoot him in the face so his mother could recognize him. His last words were said to be, "I forgive everyone. May my blood be the last that is spilled for the good of this country." He was 34 years old. His death shocked Europe, where the idea of executing a royal, even a foreign one, was still considered uncivilized. But in Mexico, it was the closing act of a bloody farce. A foreign emperor imposed by bayonets, cut down by the very people he believed he could govern with compassion. And so ended Maximilian's empire. 3 years of marble facades, borrowed authority, and misplaced dreams. His body was embalmed and returned to Austria. His wife never recovered, and the monarchy he tried to build was swept away like dust. But if Maximilian died with finality, surrounded by rifles and ceremony, the royals who came before him often met their ends in stranger, slower, more quietly horrifying ways. Not with bullets or assassins, but with locked doors, empty rooms, poisoned plates, and crowns that slipped without a sound.